Ben heard the pump burst before he even saw it. A sharp hiss, a crack, and then a blast of cold water splattered across his shirt. The metal, fatigued by the relentless drop in temperature that had gripped the valley for 3 weeks, had finally given up. He cursed, the sound snatched away immediately by the biting wind, and dropped the heavy bucket into the mud. The water soaked into the wool of his shirt, turning instantly from liquid to a rigid, icy casing against his skin. It was the kind of cold that didn't just chill, it burned, seeking the bone. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who lived alone, grabbing the heavy iron wrench from the fence post where he kept it for exactly this sort of inevitability. The sky above was the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low, promising more snow before nightfall. Ben knelt in the slush, his knees popping, and wrestled with the rusted valve. The iron bit into his palms, the cold seeping through his leather gloves, but he clamped the flow shut before the well lost its prime. He wiped his face with a forearm, leaving a streak of grease across his cheek, and stared out at the horizon. That was when he saw the color. It was wrong. In a world defined by the grays of slate, the browns of dead grass, and the blinding white of old snow, the flicker of light pink was violent in its alienness. It moved slowly against the wind, a jagged, fluttering shape coming up the long rise of the drive. Ben stood slowly, the wrench still heavy in his hand, his eyes narrowing against the glare. Visitors didn't come this far out, not in winter, and certainly not on foot. He watched the figure stumble, correct itself, and keep moving. It was a woman. She was walking with the ragged, heavy gait of someone whose legs had long since gone numb, fueled only by the desperate refusal to die. As she drew closer, the absurdity of her attire became clear. She wore a dress made for a spring church social, a light pink prairie dress with lace at the collar that was now brown with road grime and stiff with frost. She had a shawl wrapped around her, but it was threadbare, useless against the razor edge of a Wyoming winter. Ben didn't move to meet her. He waited by the broken pump, his breath steaming in the air, watching as she crossed the last 100 yards. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the water trough near his boots. She collapsed 10 feet away, her knees hitting the frozen mud with a thud that Ben felt in his own teeth. She didn't speak. She didn't beg. She simply crawled the last few feet to the trough, plunging her hands into the icy water to cup it to her lips. Ben watched the water run down her chin, soaking the front of that ridiculous pink dress. He stepped forward then, his shadow falling over her. She froze, water dripping from her nose, and looked up. Her face was gaunt, the skin tight over high cheekbones, her eyes dark and hollowed out by exhaustion. She was Chinese, her black hair matted and windblown, escaping from a loose bun. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way her chest heaved as she tried to pull air into lungs that were likely burning from the cold. Ben reached down, grabbing the iron ladle hanging from the pump, and dipped it into the reserve barrel. He held it out to her. She stared at the ladle, then at his face, gauging him. There was fear there, sharp and bright, but the thirst was stronger. She took the ladle with both hands, her fingers brushing his glove, they were like ice. She drank greedily, the sound loud in the silence of the yard. When she finished, she lowered the ladle but didn't let go, using it as an anchor to keep herself upright. "Enough," Ben said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You drink too fast, you'll sick it back up." She nodded slowly, the movement stiff. She tried to stand, her boots slipping in the mud. They were cheap leather, cracked and worn through at the toes. Ben didn't offer a hand, he watched to see if she could do it on her own. She slipped once, gritted her teeth, and forced herself up, swaying like a sapling in a gale. "Water," she rasped. Her voice was thin, brittle. "Thank you." She looked past him, toward the darkened windows of the cabin, then back to the endless grey scrubland she had walked out of. There was no horse, no wagon, no sign of anyone following her. She was entirely alone. "You got a name?" Ben asked, crossing his arms, the wrench still dangling from one hand. She hesitated, pulling the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Lynn," she said. "My name is Lynn." Ben looked at the sky again. The first flakes began to spiral down, lazy and fat. "Well, Lynn. You picked a hell of a day for a walk. He gestured toward the barn, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn timber that held the heat better than the house sometimes. Storm's breaking. You can't stay out here in that. He looked at the pink dress again, shaking his head. And you surely can't walk in that. The barn smelled of sweet hay, cured tobacco, and the warm, musk scent of the 2 quarter horses, Buster and Mare. It was a sanctuary from the biting wind, the air still and heavy. Ben pointed to a pile of woolen blankets near the tack room. Sit, he commanded, more gently than he intended. Lynn sank onto a bale of hay, her legs giving out as the adrenaline finally faded. Ben moved to the corner where he kept the lantern, striking a match against his thumbnail and lighting the wick. The glow pushed back the shadows, illuminating the vast array of tools hanging on the walls: saws, augers, hammers, lengths of chain. It was a workspace of a man who fixed everything himself because there was no one else to do it. He turned to look at her. She was shivering violently now, the warmth of the barn triggering the body's reaction to the prolonged freeze. Her teeth chattered, a rhythmic clicking sound that filled the quiet. Ben sighed, hanging the lantern on a nail. He walked to the heavy chest at the back of the room and pulled out an old buffalo hide coat. It was heavy, smelling of dust and mothballs, but it was thick. He dropped it over her shoulders. The weight of it seemed to crush her for a second before she burrowed into it, pulling the fur collar up to her ears. You running from something, or running to something? Ben asked, leaning against a support beam. He took a piece of dried beef from his pocket and tore a strip off with his teeth. Lynn watched him eat, her eyes tracking the movement. He broke off a piece and handed it to her. She took it, gnawing on the tough meat. Husband died, she said between bites, the words coming out in a flat monotone. Railroad camp. 3 days walk east. Ben knew the camp. It was a shanty town of canvas and misery, full of men who broke their backs for silver and died for nothing. They said. Go. She swallowed hard. Said no place for me there anymore. Ben didn't ask who they were. He knew the type. A widow in a camp like that was either a burden or prey. She had chosen the snow over the alternative. You got kin? Ben asked. She shook her head. No kin. Just me. She looked down at her hands, the knuckles raw and red. I thought. Maybe town. Maybe work. Ben snorted softly. Town is 40 miles that way. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder. Through the pass. You wouldn't have made another mile in those shoes. He walked over to the horses, checking their water. The rhythmic crunch of them chewing hay was a grounding sound. I ain't running a hotel, Lynn, he said, his back to her. But I ain't a murderer neither. You stay till the storm breaks. Could be 2 days, could be a week. Then I take you to town. He heard her shift in the hay, the rustle of the stiff pink fabric against the straw. I have no money, she said softly. To pay. Ben turned, resting his hand on the mare's flank. Didn't ask for money. Just stay out of the way and don't burn the place down. He picked up the empty water bucket. I got chores. Pump's busted, so we're hauling from the creek. Stay put. He walked out into the gathering dark, the wind hitting him like a physical blow. As he walked toward the creek, breaking the thin layer of ice that had already formed, he thought of the pink dress. It was a ghost of a life that didn't belong here, a fragile thing in a world of iron and ice. He chipped at the ice with his heel, the sound sharp and lonely. He filled the buckets, the water sloshing over his boots, and hauled them back. When he returned to the barn, she was asleep, curled into a ball beneath the buffalo coat, looking smaller than a child. Morning broke not with light, but with a lightening of the gray. The storm had settled in, a white curtain that erased the mountains and the fence line, reducing the world to the immediate radius of the homestead. Ben was already up, the coffee pot boiling on the cast-iron stove in the main cabin. He drank a cup standing up, staring out the window at the white void. The silence was absolute, buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. He pulled on his coat, jammed his hat low, and headed for the barn. The snow was thigh-deep in the drifts, requiring a high-step march that burned the quads. He shoved the barn door open, tracking snow inside. Lynn was already awake. She was standing by the horse stall, holding a pitchfork that was taller than she was. She had cleared the manure from the stalls, piling it neatly near the back door. It was heavy work that required back muscle she didn't look like she had. She stopped when he entered, leaning on the handle, breathing hard. The buffalo coat was draped over the stall door. She was back in the pink dress, though she had tied the skirt up around her waist with a piece of twine to keep it out of the muck, revealing thick wool leggings underneath, men's long underwear, likely stolen or scavenged. "I told you to stay put," Ben said, knocking the snow from his boots. "I pay my way," Lynn said, her voice stronger than the night before. She gripped the pitchfork tightly. "I don't need charity." Ben walked over and took the fork from her hand. Her grip was white-knuckled. "It ain't charity to let a person rest," he muttered. He checked the stalls. Clean. Surprisingly clean. She had been thorough. "You ever worked stock?" he asked. She shook her head. "I work laundry. Cook." "But I learn." She looked him in the eye, and for the first time, Ben saw the steel beneath the exhaustion. It was a quiet, desperate resolve. "Teach me," she said. It wasn't a request, it was a demand born of necessity. "Teach me to live here. To survive winter." Ben laughed, a dry, barking sound. "Lady, you don't learn this in a day. And the town is where you're going." Lynn stepped closer, closing the distance. "Town is washing clothes for whiskey money. Town is begging." She gestured to the vast, frozen world outside the barn doors. "Here is work. I can work. I am strong." Ben looked at her, really looked at her. The pink dress was stained with horse manure now. She didn't care. She wasn't asking for protection, she was asking for competence. He walked to the tool bench and picked up a pair of fencing pliers. He weighed them in his hand. "The snow brought down the north section of the corral," he said, testing her. "Wire snapped. Posts are leaning. It's miserable work. Freezing metal, heavy wood, wind that cuts you to ribbons." He held the pliers out to her. "You want to learn?" "We fix the fence." Lynn didn't hesitate. She took the pliers. They were heavy in her small hand, but she didn't drop them. "Show me," she said. Ben grunted, grabbing a coil of barbed wire and a bag of staples. "Put the coat on," he ordered. "And find some gloves. You lose a finger out there." "I ain't sewing it back on." She scrambled to put the buffalo coat back on, the massive garment swallowing her, but her face was set in a grim line. She followed him out into the whiteout, her footsteps trailing in the deep trench he cut through the snow. The wind at the North Corral was a physical assault. It screamed across the open plain, driving ice crystals into every exposed inch of skin. Ben located the break. The heavy cedar post had snapped at the base, dragging 20 feet of barbed wire down into the snow. "Dig," Ben yelled over the wind, pointing to the base of the broken post. He handed her a shovel. While she dug, hacking at the frozen earth around the stump, Ben wrestled with the wire. It was like fighting a live snake, the cold metal coiling and snapping. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was struggling. The ground was like granite. The shovel jarred her shoulders with every strike. But she didn't stop. She adjusted her grip, used her foot to drive the blade, and chipped away at the earth inch by inch. She wasn't efficient, but she was relentless. When she finally cleared the hole, she was gasping, steam billowing from her mouth like a locomotive. Ben dragged the new post over. "Hold this," he said. "Straight up. Don't let it wobble." She wrapped her arms around the rough cedar, hugging it to her chest to keep it upright as Ben backfilled the hole with rocks and dirt, tamping it down with the handle of the shovel. The wire was next. "This is the part that bites," Ben warned. He showed her how to use the claw of the hammer to pull the wire taut against the wood. "Pull it till it sings," he instructed. "Then hold it while I staple." She grabbed the wire, her gloved hand shaking with the effort. The barbs caught on the buffalo coat, tearing at the fur, but she leaned her weight back, using her whole body as a lever. "More!" Ben shouted. She grunted, digging her boots into the snow, and pulled. The wire groaned. Ben slammed the staple in, the hammer ringing against the iron. They worked down the line, fixing 3 breaks. By the time they were done, 2 hours had passed. Lynn's face was wind-burned a raw red, and she was favoring her left shoulder. But the fence was up. The cattle and horses were secure. They walked back to the cabin in silence. This time, Ben held the door open for her. The heat of the cabin hit them like a wall. Ben went straight to the stove, adding wood to the fire. Lynn stood by the door, unsure, snow melting off the buffalo coat in puddles on the floorboards. "Take it off," Ben said, gesturing to the coat. Hang it by the fire. He moved to the small kitchenette, pulling a cast-iron skillet from the wall. He sliced thick slabs of bacon and dropped them into the pan, the grease popping and sizzling. The smell filled the small room, rich and salty. Lynn hung the coat and stood near the stove, holding her hands out to the heat. She was still wearing the pink dress, now tattered at the hem and stained with mud and grease. It looked even more pathetic now, a ruin of a garment. But the woman inside it seemed different. She stood straighter. "You pull wire good," Ben said, not looking at her as he cracked eggs into the grease. It was the highest praise he could offer. Lynn looked at her hands, flexing the stiff fingers. "It is heavy," she said softly. "But it stays if you do it right," Ben corrected. He plated the food, eggs, bacon, and hardtack, and set the tin plate on the rough wooden table. He poured 2 mugs of black coffee. "Sit." Eat. She sat, eating with the same focused intensity she had shown at the pump. Ben watched her over the rim of his mug. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't the wary, hostile silence of the previous night. It was the companionable silence of 2 people who had endured the same hardship and come out the other side. "Tomorrow," Ben said, setting his mug down, "we check the trap line. Ridge is steep. Snow's deeper." Lynn looked up, wiping egg yolk from her lip with her thumb. Her eyes were tired, but the fear was gone. "I will be ready," she said. Ben nodded, a singular, sharp motion. He believed her. The snowshoes were clumsy improvisations, ashwood frames laced with rawhide that Ben had bent over steam years ago. They were too big for Lynn. She walked with a wide, rolling gait to keep the tips from catching, lifting her knees high against the resistance of the powder. They were 3 miles up the ridge, checking the steel jaw traps Ben had set along the game trails before the storm hit. The air here was thinner, sharper. It tasted of pine needles and ozone. Ben walked ahead, breaking the trail, his breath trailing behind him like an exhaust plume. He stopped at the 3rd marker, a blaze cut into a ponderosa pine, and crouched. The trap was sprung, the chain pulled taut into a drift. He hauled it up. A snowshoe hare, frozen stiff, the fur white against the gray steel. He dispatched it from the jaws with a quick, practiced movement and tied it to his belt. When he turned, Lynn was watching him. She wasn't looking at the dead animal with disgust, she was studying the mechanism of the trap. Her face was framed by the collar of the buffalo coat, her cheeks flushed dark with blood from the exertion. "Heavy," she stated, pointing to his belt. "I carry." Ben looked at the hare, then at her. She was already carrying the canvas sack with the bait and the small hatchet. "It bleeds," Ben said. "Get blood on that coat, the wolves will smell you for a mile." Lynn didn't flinch. "I wash it." "Give." She held out a gloved hand. It was a small assertion of partnership, a refusal to be merely a passenger on the trek. Ben untied the hare and handed it to her. She clipped it to her belt, the weight pulling the oversized coat tight against her hip. They moved on. The terrain grew steeper, the snow hiding treacherous scree fields beneath the drifts. At the crest of the ridge, the wind hit them with the force of a physical blow, stripping the snow from the rock and leaving slick, black ice. Lynn's left snowshoe caught on a hidden snag. She pitched forward, not crying out, just a sharp intake of breath. Ben moved before he thought, his hand shooting out to catch her arm. He gripped her bicep through the thick layers of fur and wool, hauling her back from the edge of a drop-off that tumbled down into the tree line. For a moment, they were suspended there, anchored by his grip. The wind howled around them, whipping strands of her black hair across his face. He felt the tension in her body, the vibration of her rapid heartbeat through the coat. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, the pupils blown out against the white glare of the snow. They were close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark irises, close enough to smell the wood smoke trapped in her hair. He didn't let go immediately. He held her, stabilizing her balance, his thumb pressing into the fabric of her sleeve. It was an intimacy born of danger, stripped of any pretense. "Watch your step," he said, his voice rougher than the wind. He released her slowly, ensuring she was steady. Lynn nodded, pulling the coat tighter, but she didn't step away. She stayed in his personal space for a second longer than necessary, as if drawing heat from his bulk. "I watch," she said softly. You lead. The walk back was silent, but the distance between them had shrunk. They moved in a rhythm now, two dark shapes against the blinding white, bound by the invisible tether of the near fall. The cabin was a womb of heat and shadow when they returned. The transition from the blinding white expanse to the dim, amber interior was jarring. Ben stripped off his outer layers, hanging the wet wool by the stove, while Lynn moved immediately to the tasks of the evening. She had fallen into a routine that Ben hadn't realized he was craving until it existed. She took the hare, skinning it on the work table with the small knife he had given her. Her hands, once shaking and useless with cold, were now steady, moving with a surgeon's precision. Ben sat on the bench, oiling his boots with a rag dipped in tallow. He watched her back, the way her shoulder blades moved beneath the flannel shirt she wore, one of his old ones that she had taken in at the sides with crude, sturdy stitches. The pink dress was gone, buried somewhere in her pack or used for rags. She was clad in the colors of the cabin now, grays and plaids. It made her look like she belonged to the wood and the stone, rather than being a visitor passing through. "Stew," she said, dropping the meat into the pot. "Need sage?" Ben pointed to a bundle of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. She reached up, stretching on her toes, exposing a sliver of pale skin at her waist before the shirt settled back down. Ben looked away, focusing on the leather of his boot, rubbing the grease in circles until the friction generated heat. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty anymore, it was filled with the small sounds of their coexistence, the knife against the cutting board, the pop of the fire, the creak of the floorboards. Later, after they ate, the wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. Lynn sat by the fire, mending a tear in his canvas work pants. She didn't ask for the work, she just saw the hole and fixed it. Ben watched the needle dive and surface, dive and surface. It was a hypnotic rhythm. He stood up and walked to the corner where he kept his scavenged gear. He dug out a pair of boots, smaller, older, something left behind by a traveler years ago or perhaps belonging to a life he didn't talk about. He had spent the last 2 evenings quietly working on them, relining the soles with fresh felt and greasing the leather until it was supple. He brought them to the fire and set them down next to her feet. Lynn stopped sewing. She looked at the boots, then up at him. "The ones you got are killing your feet," Ben said, staring at the fire. "Soles too thin." "These should fit." She set the sewing down and reached for the boots, running her hands over the new felt lining. She slipped her foot inside one, wiggling her toes. It was a perfect fit. She looked at him, her expression open, unguarded. "Warm," she whispered. "Thank you, Ben." It was the first time she had used his name without a prompt. The sound of it, spoken in the quiet warmth of the room, hung in the air. Ben just nodded, clearing his throat. "Need you walking right if we're gonna clear the south pasture tomorrow," he grunted, retreating to his bunk. But he lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep across the room. The scream of the mare shattered the night 3 days later. It was a high, terrified whinny that cut through the timber walls of the cabin. Ben was out of his bunk and grabbing the Winchester rifle before his eyes were fully open. "Light," he barked into the darkness. He didn't have to wait. He heard the scratch of a match, and the lantern flared to life, held steady in Lynn's hand. She was already in her boots, the buffalo coat thrown over her nightclothes. They burst out the door into the biting cold, the snow crunching violently under their feet. The barn was 50 yards away, a dark moor in the moonlight. The horses were thrashing in their stalls, the sound of hooves striking wood echoing like thunder. Ben raised the rifle, scanning the shadows. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Lynn didn't argue, but she didn't hang back. She moved to his right, lifting the lantern high to cast a pool of light into the open barn doors. The wolf was massive, a gaunt shadow of grey fur and desperation that had dug under the rotting wood of the back wall. It was snapping at the stall door, trying to get at the foal. The light caught its eyes, twin orbs of reflective green fire. It turned, snarling, baring yellow teeth at the intruders. It crouched, ready to spring not at the horse, but at them. Ben shouldered the rifle, the stock cold against his cheek. He had one shot before the animal moved. He felt Lynn step closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. She wasn't shaking. She held the light perfectly still, illuminating the target. It was an act of supreme trust. If he missed, the beast would be on them in seconds. Ben exhaled, the cloud of white breath obscuring his vision for a split second, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. The wolf dropped mid-spring, sliding across the hay in a heap of fur. Silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. The horses were still blowing hard, stomping nervously, but the threat was gone. Ben lowered the rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Lynn. She was staring at the dead wolf, the lantern still held high. Slowly, she lowered her arm, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush. She sagged against a support beam. Ben moved to her, checking her for injuries, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You all right?" he asked, his voice urgent. She looked up at him, her face pale in the lantern light, but her eyes fierce. "I held it steady," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't shake, no," Ben said, and the admiration in his voice was thick and real. "You didn't shake." He kept his hands on her shoulders, the layers of wool between them feeling suddenly thin. The air in the barn was freezing, but the heat radiating from her was palpable. For a moment, the gap between survival and something else bridged. He wanted to pull her in, to bury his face in the crook of her neck to hide from the cold and the killing. Instead, he squeezed her shoulders once, hard. "Good work," he said. "Let's get this carcass out before it freezes to the floor." They dragged the weight together, shoulder to shoulder, into the night. The exertion of the night took its toll. By morning, Ben woke with a fire in his chest that had nothing to do with the stove. His limbs felt like they were filled with lead shot, and a dry, hacking cough rattled his ribs. He tried to swing his legs out of the bunk, but the room spun violently. He collapsed back onto the mattress, groaning. He had pushed too hard, too long, and the winter had finally found a chink in his armor. He closed his eyes, drifting into a feverish haze. When he opened them again, Lynn was there. She wasn't panicking. She was cool, efficient, a general on a battlefield. She placed a hand on his forehead, her palm rough but blissfully cool. "You burn," she said simply. "Stay." For 2 days, the roles reversed. The man who defined himself by his ability to provide and protect was reduced to a shivering invalid. Lynn took over the world. Ben heard her chopping wood outside, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing through the cabin walls. He heard her hauling water, feeding the horses, keeping the stove fed. She came to him at intervals with broth made from the rabbit, lifting his head to help him drink. She had no medicine, but she had old knowledge. She made a poultice from pine resin and boiled bark, spreading it on his chest. The smell was pungent and sharp, clearing his head. In the depth of the second night, the fever peaked. Ben was shaking so hard his teeth clicked, despite the pile of blankets Lynn had heaped on him. He felt the mattress depress as she sat beside him. "Cold," he muttered, delirious. Too cold. He felt her hesitate, then the rustle of fabric. She slid under the heavy buffalo robe, lying beside him on the narrow bunk. She didn't touch him tentatively. She pressed her body against his side, wrapping her arm across his chest, her legs tangling with his. She was a furnace of living heat. "I am here," she whispered against his ear. "I have you." It was survival, body heat to fight hypothermia, but it was also the shattering of the last barrier. Ben turned his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of smoke and soap. He was too weak to move, but he anchored himself to her presence. She was the only solid thing in a world that was spinning away. He fell asleep to the sound of her heartbeat against his back, a steady drumbeat that promised he wasn't alone. The fever broke with the dawn of the fourth day. Ben woke up weak, stripped out and hollow, but clear-headed. The weight beside him was gone, but the impression of her body remained in the straw-tick mattress. He sat up, the room steady. Sunlight, real, golden sunlight, not the grey filter of the storm, was streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He could hear the drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the eaves. The Chinook had come. The warm wind was eating the snow, turning the white prison into a world of mud and running water. He dressed slowly, his legs shaky, and walked out to the porch. Lynn was there, standing by the railing, looking out at the valley. The road was visible again, a brown scar winding through the receding white. The pass would be open. She heard the door creak and turned. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but she smiled when she saw him standing. It was a small, private smile. "The fever is gone," she said. "The snow goes too," Ben nodded, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at the road, then at her. This was the moment. The deal was struck, shelter until the storm broke, then town. He cleared his throat. "Wagon needs greasing," he said, testing the words. "But the road is clear. Could make town by sundown." Lynn turned back to the horizon. She ran her hand along the rough wood of the railing. "Town," she repeated. She looked at the pump, which was still wrapped in the burlap sacking they had used to insulate it. She looked at the barn where she had faced the wolf. She looked at the fence line they had pulled tight. "The pump needs a new washer," she said, her voice even. "And the south pasture. The wire is still loose near the creek." She turned to face him fully. "I do not think the town needs me, Ben. I think the work is here." Ben looked at her. He saw the pink dress in his memory, a ghost of a weak thing that had arrived and died here. The woman standing before him was forged in iron and ice. She was wearing his shirt, her boots, and a resolve that matched his own. He didn't smile, cowboys didn't smile when the world shifted on its axis, but the tension in his shoulders, a tension he had carried for 10 years of solitude, finally released. He pushed off the doorframe and walked to the edge of the porch, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. He looked out at the muddy, ugly, beautiful land. "Suppose it is," he said quietly. "Water's boiling. I'll make coffee." He turned back to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "2 cups," he added. Lynn watched him go, then turned back to the valley, the sun warm on her face, no longer searching for a road out.